Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much to our colleagues at Charity Village for organizing and collaborating with us on this exciting new piece of research and thinking about volunteer engagement. I'm going to quickly introduce myself and then hand it over to my two colleagues on the panel. So my name is Paula, as you know, and I've been with Volunteer Canada this time since 2010, but within the Volunteer Centre movement since the 90s. I serve currently as the president and CEO, and very passionate about us all working together, whether we're in government, businesses, nonprofit sector, educational facilities, you name it. We all have a role to play in building civil society. Over to you, Trevor.
Trevor, you might be muted.
Sorry, I was muted and I was talking away there. My apologies. Thank you very much, Paula, for the introduction. I am also delighted to join today's call. So I'm Trevor Cron, the Director of Community Investment at Investors Group. So we've been a longtime partner of Volunteer Canada's, and one of our national areas of focus is volunteer engagement and volunteering. And we've been fortunate enough to have a wonderful partnership over the years. And I'm here today to share a little bit about some recent changes we've made to some of our volunteer recognition programs based on research we've done in partnership with them. So thank you for having me.
So hello, my name is Allison Stevens. I have been a lifelong volunteer. Been staff and executive director of a volunteer center for many years, and am also passionate about volunteer engagement, I guess I would say. I know we're going to play with these terms a bit today. I've been very pleased to work with Volunteer Canada since last summer as a consultant, working mainly with the Volunteer Centre Network, but also on some other interesting projects. So looking forward to today.
Go ahead, Jeff. Excellent. So it's back to me, Paula. So I thought I would start off with giving you a little bit of an overview of some of the research that we've done in this area. So to give you some context, Volunteer Canada and Investors Group have been working together on the area of volunteer recognition for over 15 years. And we've been really interested in understanding, first of all, what kinds of experiences volunteers have with respect to volunteer recognition, how that affects their satisfaction, and how that can also have an impact on our ability to recruit and retain volunteers. So that was one thing that we've worked well together over the years, including an annual campaign for National Volunteer Week. A few years ago, we were very concerned that there was a growing gap between the way volunteers wanted to be recognized and how organizations were engaged in different activities around volunteer recognition. And so in 2013, we did a study to better understand the views of volunteers and the practices of organizations. And it confirmed some of the things that many of us had been hearing. That is, firstly, while many people do appreciate banquets and certificates and formal ways of volunteer recognition, many others would prefer something that is more organic, ongoing, authentic thank yous. But the two key things that came out of that study were a desire on the part of volunteers to know the impact of the volunteering and the time that they were contributing. What difference does it make to the people and the communities and the planet that has motivated me to volunteer in the first place? Secondly, what are the skills and competencies that I'm demonstrating through my volunteering, and how can that be recognized? So we were looking at ways to demonstrate the impact and communicate that to volunteers, and ways to recognize and affirm the skills and competencies that volunteers were demonstrating through their volunteering. A few years later, we became very interested in the notion of volunteering and how people were looking at volunteering. And this started back in 2011 when we had a roundtable with the Governor General, His Excellency David Johnston, around what do we want the world of volunteering to look like in 2017. And of course, here we are in 2017, and since then, we've been speaking to people in all parts of the country around not just how do we want to recognize volunteers, that is, appreciate, thank, and demonstrate the value of volunteering, but how do we actually recognize when someone is volunteering? How do we recognize it in others? How do we recognize it in ourselves? Because some of the things that came out of that roundtable and since was the desire for us to have a broader definition of volunteering, to really look more at some of the newer forms and organic movements that are happening, perhaps that look somewhat informal, but really we ought to count the good work that people are doing. So when we engaged with Investors Group on this topic, we agreed to work together on better understanding this. We engaged Ipsos Public Affairs to do a public opinion poll. We did a literature review, and we spoke with colleagues around the world and tried to get a sense of how is the notion of volunteering and personal, community, workplace, affiliation, how is that all coming together in terms of the many ways people are volunteering? So here are a few of the highlights of the public opinion poll findings. And so as you can see here, many people agreed that, that people do have a personal responsibility to help others. That may come in different forms and shapes, but people by and large feel that helping others is important. But beyond that kind of direct support that you provide to individuals, people also saw volunteering and their responsibility in terms of living in community and society as an opportunity to participate and have a voice in shaping the community. So how do the values that we have individually and collectively, how can they have an impact on the way we work as a community and society? And how can we have more direct leadership and contribution to the way we all live and work together. The other thing that we learned was that people are really more active than we think, because typically many of the studies that measure the volunteer rate measure formal volunteering roles through a not-for-profit organization or charity, as opposed to the many other ways people have either in a structured way or informally help friends, neighbors, and family members. So I will move on. In terms of looking at expanding the definition of volunteering, I referred to earlier that that discussion started in 2011, and you can see some of the results of that roundtable. In the most recent edition of the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement, we incorporated something we call the spectrum of volunteer engagement into that code in response to what people were asking for. And that spectrum recognizes that individuals express their interest in community starting from being informed about an issue. So you could perhaps regularly read a blog and gather news about an issue that matters to you. Let's say, for example, if it is teen mental health issues, and you could also support that issue by contributing in some way to an event or to sharing the information that you've received with others to help promote awareness about the issue. And then it can be more structured in terms of actively participating in a program or service that that organization provides. And then finally, there's areas of leadership and capacity building. So the spectrum of engagement really recognized not that one needs to lead to the other, but that all forms of engagement around an issue are valid and important. And finally, when we looked at some of the research that was done by Employment and Social Development Canada by Trina Isaacson in 2013, again, it recognized that there are ways of contributing beyond giving and volunteering in a formal way. Around the world, some of you may know of the Community Life Survey that's done each year in the UK, and we learned that in recent years, the measurement includes formal, informal volunteering, charitable giving, and what they're calling social action. So again, there's a desire to count, recognize, and measure more than formal volunteering. Another index that's done every year, the World Giving Index, looks at the generosity of 160 different countries. And again, in measuring the generosity of individuals in these countries, the formal, informal, and more organic ways of contributing and supporting issues and shaping communities is counted. Finally, some research that was done in the Netherlands looked at the systems world and the life world. The systems world being the world that we have all come to enjoy and be proud of in the nonprofit sector, that is the professionalization of volunteer engagement with practices and policies and templates and systems and ways of measuring things that we feel is the responsible way to approach the work that we do in our organization. But the life world is the world of people spontaneously and informally responding to what's going on in their families, neighborhoods, and communities. And the question they asked in that study was, how can what we've learned from the system world be of benefit to support and promote what's going on in the life world? So when we looked at the statistics, the most recent survey of giving and volunteering that Statistics Canada releases, the latest in 2013, we saw that the 12.7 million Canadians volunteering and the 44% of people 15 and over volunteering that rate, while it's great, it was slightly lower. And I know that many folks that are probably participating right now and around, certainly around the country, were very concerned when we saw that drop. And as we tried to analyze what was going on, one of the things that we learned was a contributing factor, aside from the fact that, yes, there are demographics that have, have affected more older adults who have a lower volunteer rate but give more hours, more people engaged in caregiving in their families and therefore not as available. What we also learned was that there is a very large increase and momentum growing for the do-it-yourself movement, for the organic movement. People are able to mount public awareness campaigns through social media. They are able to raise funds, for example, to raise funds for a funeral that's taking place after a tragedy, to make a van more accessible for a neighbor who has a child with a disability. People are able to do great things outside of organizations. And so what does this mean for us? Are we suggesting that the formal and structured world of volunteering in not-for-profit organizations is going to disappear? I'm not suggesting that at all. And as we all know, there are many things that require that level of structure and the processes that we've put in place. On the other hand, the question may be, what can we do in our organizations to recognize, support, and facilitate the other forms of giving that are taking place? And that's, I think, an exciting challenge for us to have, because if we were in a situation where people were not expressing generosity and concern and engagement in community, that would be a problem. Whereas what we have now is people choosing to get engaged and involved in different ways. So that led to the notion of individual social responsibility, ISR. So like you would find in workplaces or businesses that have CSR, corporate social responsibility, the individual social responsibility really relates to all the decisions we make during the day in terms of expressing our values. So it could be, for example, waking up in the morning, composting, your orange peel, choosing to carpool with someone or to walk, picking up a coffee from a coffee shop that only employs youth at risk and also sells fair trade coffee, and being on a board and mentoring a child and picking up groceries. So it's all the various things that we do throughout the day that really contribute to our individual social responsibility. And again, the challenge for us is not to sit back and say everything is going to be done outside of organizations. It's all up to the individual, which of course in the end we are individuals who participate. But again, the challenge for us is how do we, as specialists in volunteer engagement or community engagement, facilitate and make space within our organizations for people to get involved in more informal ways, to recognize and salute those folks that are doing that. So I think with that, I will end with the definition that we have. And I know that both Trevor and Allison have things to say about what's going on in from their point of view. So our questions that we leave you with is, how can we recognize a broader spectrum of engagement within the context of ISR? How can the structures that we have put in place for formal volunteering also support other aspects of ISR? And what are the implications for traditional CSR programs? Thank you.
Okay, so that's, go for it, Trevor.
Okay, thank you, Paula, for that, the background and context. So I'm going to spend a little time speaking about, you know, what we've done with this information at Investors Group. So just to provide some background on sort of how our programs look. So we have definitely been involved in community for decades. We have a very grassroots approach where, you know, we have our corporate employees that make up a portion of our people, but by far and large, the larger group is our advisor network, and they're, you know, over 3,500 strong, and they're located in communities all across the country. So we have a lot of people right down in their local communities making a difference, getting involved, and you know, we're fortunate that we have a history of attracting people that have a sense of caring for their community and caring for people. And I guess it goes, you know, it goes with the territory of, as a business, this is what we do. We help Canadians with their financial situation, and that involves all aspects of their life. So for many years, we have recognized and celebrated our staff and our advisors who demonstrate their commitment to community. You know, it was over 10 years ago now, I think it's about 12 years ago, we actually created very formal programs, like I think a lot of companies have in place. We created two different programs. So one that was more for corporate employees and one that was for our advisor network. And they're unique, but they share some similarities in that they get a lot of the same sort of recognition and types of benefits. So on the employee side, we have a quarterly award, and again, the focus had always been on very traditional volunteering, you know, sitting on boards, spending hours and hours with different organizations over the years. So we were looking for those sorts of things, and those were the types of people we were recognizing. They would be quarterly that we would hand them out, and then there was also an annual one that we would hand out, and the president actually would hand that one out himself to the employee directly, and we would have a formal reception. We would invite everybody and announce them all. So, you know, very structured, very rigid, very formal. They were once in a lifetime volunteer awards. You could only sort of win them once. And again, the benefits were quite substantial, but it was very exclusive, as you can tell. And the benefits would be, you know, a large donation to the charity of their choice. They would get a physical award. We would communicate it internally through various bulletins to our employees, among a few other benefits. On the advisor side of things, again, very exclusive. There were certain requirements just from we call them achievement levels. So it's sort of our higher end, our more successful advisors. We had eligibility criteria for that. And then as well, we were looking for very traditional volunteering again. So many hours, you know, serving on boards, all these sorts of things. And these were handed out once a year. So once a year, they would be presented again by our president at a formal sales conference in front of their peers. And again, they would get very significant benefits. In this case, we would actually set up a foundation account for the advisor that would win each year, and they would be able to name the account and manage the grants that flow out of that account. We set up an alumni account for award winners that they all get to provide input for as to where the grants go from that alumni account. They too get a physical award, they get a plaque, and in the case of the advisors, because they are face and voice in the communities, we would actually do an ad in the local newspaper and send out a letter to all the clients. So we were doing a lot in the background. We were, the benefits were very high level, but again, very exclusive program. So moving on to the next slide, when we'd sort of been, going through the steps of the program year over year. In the beginning, they were both very healthy. Over time, we did notice they started lagging, and the quality and the quantity of submissions we were getting were sort of not at the same level as the very early stages of the program, and we were starting to see that maybe something had to change. And so we took a look. We did research alongside Volunteer Canada, both internally and just broadly across Canada, and recognized that we needed to evolve this, and we needed to evolve it with employees' growing interest and the different ways people were volunteering today. It wasn't all just traditional. There are different ways you can volunteer that are very innovative, creative, that have huge impact on organizations that wouldn't necessarily qualify someone to be recognized through our existing programs. So, and based on the survey findings from the Volunteer Canada research, we also understood that the things we were doing that we thought we were hitting on the right points weren't necessarily so. So it didn't necessarily have to be exclusive. In fact, maybe that was limiting our program and keeping it from recognizing more things that were going on and more people, and engaging our employees and advisors in a better way. Perhaps it didn't have to be so formal. Was that really the way they wanted to be recognized? The survey was saying that wasn't actually what they preferred. Volunteers wanted ultimately to understand the impact of their efforts, and they wanted timely personal recognition. So taking a look at our programs, we identified a need to start switching it up and changing it a bit. In the old world, we sort of recognized what we called the volunteer superstars. These were the people that, obviously they had the time and commitment and were putting in many hours over multiple years and building this history, this lifetime of, a volunteer resume, if you will. But when you have that sort of approach, what we were missing out on was all these other great things that many other people were doing that we weren't recognizing. And so this program was relevant to a very small population within our company. So if we can move on to the next slide, where we went from there, we created a new community impact program. So we wanted to recognize that volunteer contributions of all types and sizes made an impact, and it didn't have to be traditional, and we wanted to do this for people across the country. So we have now fully sort of switched up our employee volunteer recognition program. Because of the timing of the one for our advisors, we always launch that one in the fall, and so we're looking to make similar changes to that one. That'll be coming up. We're hoping to launch that one in a few months' time. But I'm happy to say we've had some early success with the launch of the new employee program. So it's really more about, recognizing this new notion of individual social responsibility and what we are asking employees to do now. So first of all, we've opened it up. It doesn't have to be, extreme volunteer hours and commitments made and over years and years. We are recognizing individuals for, it could be something very short term, an innovative, a creative initiative they undertook. One perfect example of someone we've recognized already was a designer on our design team. And what he had done is he had revamped the branding and the logos for two charities that he was passionate about. And under the old program, he likely wouldn't have been recognized because of the way we sort of scored it or the way we evaluated it. But in today's program, we were able to feature him and the great work he was doing. And you know, what we're finding already is employees are thrilled about the new approach, much more engaging to many more of our employees. And what we're asking them to do is to tell their story. It's quite simple. So instead of it looking like a bullet point list of everything they've done and roles they've held and all those sorts of things, we ask them to tell us their volunteer story. And so we make a conscious effort to not just feature the volunteer, but we also feature the organization, which obviously they're very passionate about, and the impact of their efforts. So we're sort of featuring all those things together, and it's not you know, restricted to a certain time frame as in before, where it was quarterly or annual, and sometimes you know, you may be nominated for recognition and actually not be recognized for a year or two. Rather, here are sort of our uncommunicated, or we haven't communicated the goal, but we're looking to try and recognize 2 employees every month. Now, that doesn't mean we have to, but if we're getting the submissions that we need and they're of the right sort of you know, quality of stories we're looking for, that is sort of our goal. So I'm happy to say since we launched it in February, we haven't had a problem hitting that. And we are recognizing all sorts of different efforts. And, you know, this has demonstrated to us that it has definitely resonated better with our employees because, you know, last year with the quarterly annual format, we recognized a total of 5 employees. Well, this year we're already at 8. So, you know, it's wonderful that we can do this. The feedback we're getting, even from people that haven't been recognized, has been positive. They like the fact that, you know, we have made this more inclusive and that it is relevant to more people. And they also appreciate the fact that we're talking a lot more about the impact. And, you know, it's not just about the volunteer, but the volunteer wouldn't be volunteering in the first place if they weren't passionate about the organization and the impact. So we're tying that all together and finding ways to engage, you know, others around it as well. So, you know, we've been reaching out to our leaders. We've been asking leaders to ensure that when an employee is recognized under them, that they engage as well. And here's a great touch point for them, a positive touch point, to recognize them in front of their team. And, you know, overall, we've just, we feel we're definitely on the right track and getting at this whole notion of individual social responsibility. And to us, this has been, you know, a good example of shifting a traditional volunteer recognition program into something sort of more current, inclusive, engaging, and at the end, we hope more impactful. So that is sort of my, you know, my summary on our program, and happy to take questions at the end as well.
Great, thanks, Trevor. So we're going to go over to Allison for the Volunteer Center perspective. Allison?
Well, hello there. I just thank you, Trevor. It's interesting how you touched on both the aspects of recognition, volunteer recognition. I like that. And I've never heard the term extreme volunteering before, so that's really an interesting notion to me. We have extreme sports, and now we have extreme volunteering. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the ISR and how this can impact or could impact volunteer centers. Informal volunteering has always existed. In fact, it predated formal volunteering in Canada and elsewhere. People helped their neighbors, organized community events. They came together in emergencies. Most community organizations, in fact, were founded by individuals who were informal volunteers. They saw a need in their community, wanted to improve something, and they decided to corral and organize their efforts in order to be more effective. There was no volunteer manager recruiting them to do this work. So formal and informal volunteering have existed side by side, and they will continue to do so. What is different now is a change in people's habits and expectations, aided and abetted by developments in technology and communications. These have facilitated an increase in informal volunteering and a decrease in formal volunteering. It remains to be seen if the overall level of Canadians' participation in their communities and beyond has and will continue to remain stable or to increase. The structure and activities of volunteer centres across Canada vary considerably, but something that is in common to the mandates of them all is connecting people with opportunities to get involved. For decades now, this has meant recruiting people to fill volunteer opportunities within community organizations. There has been a focus on defining roles, clarifying volunteer responsibilities, screening volunteers to ensure a good fit and minimize risk, providing sufficient and appropriate supervision. All core elements of a structured volunteer program, a bit what Paula was referring to, the systems. At the same time, they have been promoting and encouraging volunteering in general and keeping an eye on the evolution of people's motivations to give their time, energy, and talents. Volunteer centers have therefore had to adapt to the increased interest in short-term and event volunteering, virtual volunteering, pro bono volunteering, group and family volunteering, corporate volunteering, and the list goes on. And those that offer training and support to the organizations in their milieu have worked with them to adapt their own programs and activities in order to take advantage of these emerging trends. This study has made it clear that these trends are continuing and being complemented by all sorts of other ways that Canadians want to and can be involved in their communities, putting their values into action. It is no longer a question of understanding how and where Canadians want to volunteer, the number of volunteer hours, the percentages, but understanding that they can and do make myriad choices every day that reflect their values and their desire to affect change. So what does this mean for volunteer centers? Certainly, there will always be a need for formal volunteering. As Paula mentioned, many services delivered by volunteers are vital and require structure, regularity, and constancy. For example, Meals on Wheels delivery, accompaniment and support of those who are sick or dying or struggling with addiction, after-school program, homework support, language tutoring for new Canadians, mentoring at-risk youth. Volunteer centers can therefore continue to recruit and recruit volunteers to those roles, and if they analyze the data from the study, they could be able to access a wider audience. More focused recruitment and promotion strategies could reach people who are already aware of the issues or problems involved, but who are bypassing organizations in their efforts to help. Secondly, volunteer centers can get in on the informal side of on the informal side of individual social responsibility by including these actions as part of their overall definition of volunteering. Not just by adjusting vocabulary, but also by supporting spontaneous efforts when possible. For example, they can take a role in emergency situations. They can support online campaigns of various kinds. They can include informal volunteering in their recognition strategies. They can also reflect on the results of the study to develop their own activities that could tap into this energy and will to contribute to positive change. Finally, as leaders and specialists in volunteer engagement, volunteer centers can work with organizations in their milieu, informing them of this trend if they are not already aware of it, helping them to evaluate how engaging people on a more spontaneous level fits with their overall missions and objectives, and possibly partnering with them on special projects that might appeal to today's plugged-in and values-driven citizens. Certainly, volunteer centers are faced with some important strategic decisions, the principal one being whether to embrace the whole range of ISV in their mandates or not. If they decide to do so, they face further decisions about how to put this changed mandate into action, how to present the results of this study to existing and potential partners to ensure current and future funding, how to use these results to frame new projects and outreach efforts, as well as renewed ways of recognizing volunteering across the spectrum. If they decide not to embrace individual social responsibility in its entirety, they need to decide how to consolidate their expertise in formal volunteering, how to better focus their recruitment efforts, and to continue supporting local volunteer managers. there's been a lot of talk about rebranding and taking the word volunteer. I noticed that we have not removed the word volunteer from any of these discussions. So I don't think that throwing out the word volunteer is the answer. But there certainly needs to be a strategic reflection that involves not just the volunteer coordinator or recruiter, not just the executive director, but across the board in a volunteer center to help, get buy-in and make a kind of strategic decision about how to proceed with this new volunteer landscape. While there are risks involved either way, there are opportunities as well. And the greater risk for volunteer centers is to simply ignore the findings of the study. Thank you, Anna.
Great, thanks, Al.
Very curious to hear your questions.
Great. So this is Marina from Charity Village here, and we're going to jump into our Q&A questions. So please do just drop your questions in the chat or question box. And if you have a question for a specific presenter, feel free to pop their name in there too, and we'll do our best to get that to them. So I'd like to start off with a kind of general question that was emailed to us from David, and I think it might kick things off in a really great way. David asks, when we're looking at this concept of ISR, and everyone who helps is a volunteer, albeit maybe in a more informal way, what does that really mean for volunteer recognition as a whole? And, does that mean that we're sort of choosing to recognize volunteers that make very specific contributions? So perhaps maybe we can start off with Paula, and perhaps you all can weigh in on that question.
Fantastic. And I think that when we think about recognition, part of it, if we use the word recognition to say to acknowledge and recognize that people contribute in many ways, and when we talk about our language around how people are involved in community, if it's expansive and includes these forms, that's a form of recognition by speaking about it and including it in our narrative about how people are involved. So I think that's one thing, as opposed to saying, do you volunteer or not? And by volunteer, I mean, are you with an organization or not? And then people will not see themselves inside that picture. So I think it's part of the way we talk about how people are involved in community that helps us recognize all the efforts that take place. So an example being, and it relates to something that Trevor was saying and Allison was saying, there's a woman in my community who walks around, and if she sees a dead bird outside a building and observes that it's possibly because they haven't put decals on their windows to prevent birds from flying into it, she will get in touch with the property manager. She does not do that through an organization. And it's a cool story, and it's inspiring, and it's actually having an impact. So I think that somehow if these kinds of stories get into either the way companies recognize the things that people are doing, or the stories that we all tell about those who volunteer, that's a form of recognition, talking about it being part of our narrative. And then informal ways, if there are programs that people have that can expand their criteria, that's also great.
It's Allison here. I like a term that has been used today, which is inclusive. We tend to use it in so many different ways to talk about race and culture and geographic differences, but in fact, I think what we're talking about is just making our notion of volunteer and volunteerism more inclusive. And so I think it's more subtle than how we're going to measure it. I think it's a great idea to think of the stories that we tell and the way we recognize it in talking about it. It doesn't have to be put into a category of which kind of volunteering it is. It's more of the fact that we're talking about it. That is a recognition in itself. And I think that different organizations and different volunteer centers will find different ways of doing this.
And to that point, Allison, of being inclusive, from Investors Group's perspective, we're certainly not excluding traditional volunteering. I mean, that still stands. We'll still recognize that, absolutely, but it was just sort of opening the door to things just beyond that as well. So to that point exactly, it's just about recognizing more than just traditional volunteering, but not taking away from it or you know, minimizing it by any means.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Okay, so moving on, we've had a number of participants ask if we could elaborate a little bit on some of the non-traditional roles that volunteers are playing. So perhaps you know, we could discuss that a little bit more in detail.
Well, I can give an example of several instances during, I live in Montreal, and we had some extensive flooding this spring. And there were all kinds of spontaneous citizens just organizing, whether it was food contributions, shelter, and yes, there were formal people that did formally volunteer through the Red Cross, etc. But very often the volunteer centers were bypassed and organizations were bypassed, and it was just individuals wanting to help. Now I know that's one kind of an example, but it's a current one, and I know it's probably happening elsewhere when there are other, you know, wildfires and other disasters that take place.
It's Paul, and I think that some of the stories that I've heard with respect to this have to do with some of the examples I gave earlier, which is that when something happens in a neighborhood or a community, that people are organizing fundraisers and responses to those situations. Another example is that I know somebody who had triplets and was feeling overwhelmed and didn't have any extended family living in the community. And her workmates, who happened to work for a federal department, and they had a day off a year, they organized themselves to use that day to be able to help that person. But initially there was a question as to whether or not it would count because it wasn't with an organization. And of course, eventually it was certainly approved by many, many managers. But that was a really nice example where people said, yeah, that's really important. That's helping someone. There was some structure around it, but it would have typically, it was not through directly through an organization.
Fantastic. And we've had quite a few questions come up for Trevor. So Trevor, we're going to try not to overwhelm you here. But let's start with a really great question from Jeff. Does Investors Group share externally about how you recognize volunteers and your extensive volunteer programs, and especially when recruiting new talent? Is this something that you find is really important to potential new employees and partners?
Yeah, we definitely do talk about it in a number of ways outside of the company. I mean, we have an annual corporate responsibility report, and we include details about some of the various programs within that. When it comes to, you know, onboarding, it is something that we do talk to employees about, is the opportunities to volunteer. We have a fairly healthy employee volunteer program here where, you know, there's actually a steering committee that's headed up by one of our executive vice presidents, and then underneath that committee of subcommittees that do different things. So it might be the community outreach committee that determines where our employees go and volunteer in the community. It might be our United Way campaign committee. So there's quite a number of opportunities to find what you're passionate about and get involved if that's something that's of interest to you. So yes, we definitely do communicate it externally. And I mean, we're just going through some changes right now. We not only have a new president and CEO, we have a new chief marketing officer. And so we're taking a look at everything we do today. And I mean, I think we will want to, you know, tell our story a little more. So I think you might see that, and through social media, we do things as well, which I think we might ramp up even more in future. So there are different ways that we're trying to share that, not only from a we're proud of what we're doing and of our people. But as you mentioned, the recruitment aspect, definitely, we know millennials are coming up. They're looking for these things, so we see that as a way to attract new talent as well.
Wonderful. And this next question, I'm going to pitch to you first, Trevor, but Paula and Allison may want to jump in on this as well. We've had a number of participants asking about how you actually qualify or verify, numbers of hours or things like that when the volunteering is very informal. So a lot of our participants have been asking about the sort of nature of that. It's sort of hard already with formal volunteers. How do we do that with the informal volunteers?
That's a great question. So what I can tell you is, aside from our volunteer recognition program, we do run 2 different Dollars for Doers programs. So where people go and they volunteer and they sort of tell us what they've done, they tell us the hours. We will provide grants based on their volunteer efforts. So in those cases, they do report that information up front, and we do random audits. I mean, the intention is not to catch people trying to sneak anything by, but it is to sort of, make sure we're reporting on numbers that we're comfortable with and those sorts of things. So there is some, auditing done there. As far as our employee volunteer recognition program, there is a bit of a trust factor there, and we don't go and audit anything. And again, it's less about, we've moved away from, how many hours, how long, all of those sorts of things. We're asking them for their story, and that we of course get first from the employee, or people can be nominated, so it's not always directly from the person. But the first thing we do once they're selected is we go to them and we make sure they're comfortable with it, because that's the other thing. Not everybody does want to be recognized. So we go to them and we tell them we'd like to recognize them and make sure they're comfortable with it. And then at that point, we reach out to the organization, but with the 2 parties together, we tell the story, we get the information we need. So that's a way, I guess, of us sort of, confirming what they've said is true. And again, it's not that we're trying to catch anyone, but if we're reporting on this, if we're telling the story, we want to make sure that we're being factual and that we trust the information we're sharing externally.
And one of the things that Volunteer Canada works with is the Corporate Council of Volunteering, which Investors Group is a member of, and about 20 other leading corporations that have really advanced corporate social responsibility and employee volunteering programs. And the conversation around that table has been around the importance of 3 things. One is being more flexible about where someone can volunteer when they're asking for time off, for example. Second of all, making sure that the recognition program you have is diverse. So in some cases, as Trevor was saying, if it's a matter of making a donation to a charity, then it has to be time with a charity. But if it's a matter of recognition in the form of telling a story, then that could be more inclusive of other forms of recognition. So being flexible, being inclusive, and having a diverse range of recognition where it doesn't always depend on numbers of hours, but sometimes it's the inspiration from the story or the impact of that effort that is the essence of the recognition, as opposed to a formula for calculating the economic value or the eligibility for a donation.
It's Allison here. I'd like to just add something. I think when you're talking about a company or any kind of an organization that has a handle on who we're talking about, it's not so complex, and I agree that there's some issues there, but moving away from it being tied to an organization will be a bit of a challenge, but I see it's all very doable. I think where it's much more difficult is for volunteer centers, because already there's a great a difficulty for volunteer centers to have the statistics to say the number of hours and the number of other number of volunteers, and very often it's indirect for volunteer centers because it's with organizations. So who are we talking about? And I think what the challenge for volunteer centers is finding the people. Who is volunteering in this different way that isn't through a volunteer center or through an organization? And so the second part of recognizing it is what would come next, but how you actually track it or count it, I think that it's going to have to be through stories and recognition more, and impact, and the stories will lead to impact, and perhaps people, witnesses, or whatever you want to say, references, people who talk about what the person or the group accomplished. I really think that, we're not talking about a set number of individuals that are tied to a volunteer center. It's in a sense, it's the entire city. It's every citizen of the city. So it's just a little extra wrinkle there.
It's definitely a complicated topic for sure. Another very interesting question. Have any of you seen certain technologies that are emerging to really help support ISR?
It's Paula speaking from Volunteer Canada, and we are in the process of developing something with Investors Group, so stay tuned. But we're quite excited about the notion of some kind of app where individuals could establish their goals with respect to their own values and how they could be expressed through various types of ISR activities, how they could track it, but then how we could somehow map that within communities to see what folks are doing.
Fantastic. So it sounds like you've really anticipated the need there, and answered that question. That's great. So we've had now a lot of questions as well about doing the actual recognition, the thank yous. So let's start off with maybe all three of you can join in on this, some ideas about really giving the authentic and organic thank yous. What does that really look like?
Well, one of the things that people have said is that on an ongoing basis, informally, when someone notices someone being present, or someone notices, someone is leaving after they've done a shift, but that ongoing personal thank you where other team members in an organization, be it staff or other volunteers, simply do say, glad you're here, and thank you. So, that's a light thing. But then secondly, there are times when there is an incident that occurs, or a difficult shift that someone has, let's say on a helpline and so on. And then, there's debriefing with them, but there's also saying, wow, that was great how we managed through that, that difficult situation. And sometimes the next time they come in, again, recognize that, say we were also, so moved by how flexible you were and how you really had your presence felt by that individual who was under stress. We were listening to it again or thinking about it again, and that was awesome.
Yeah, it's Allison here. That's a great example, Paula, because it's very specific to what the person did, and I think that this is one of the ways in which the general recognition or the formal recognition strategies don't necessarily hit home, or even the thank yous that are just thanks so much, or you give so much time and we really appreciate it. But when somebody is actually, when you identify what it is that's so special and so good about what they did, or so what the impact that it had. So I think this is a message we've been getting for many years about how, yes, there are people who like the plaques and all of that, but universally people like to see what was the impact of what they did. And so there isn't really a formula for it. You really have to spend time on it and think about it. And I'd just like to add that something that I experienced a lot and heard about was how much a volunteer or someone who's helping you in some way in an organization, or even not, but really, I just lost my train of thought. Likes to be, if you want their feedback, asking them for their feedback, their input on how to improve things, on even how to recognize volunteering, but on any aspect of where you think their experience could actually contribute to changing or improving things in your organization.
And I would add to, I agree with everything being said here, and I would add to that, I think you're bang on about situations are unique. You can't just sort of have a blanket statement. What do all volunteers think is most important? Because, if we're being honest, it's different for everybody. And for some, millennials that are just entering the workforce, they may want, opportunities to get in front of executives or be recognized in front of their leader, or there might be more of that, whereas a baby boomer nearing retirement might just be all they want to know is the impact, and that's what they're sort of most interested in, and they don't care about any career or professional sort of opportunities that way. So I think it is always keeping your audience in mind and understanding that people do have different motivations, but if there's an overlying theme, I think the impact one and being very timely, not, if they volunteer 1 week and then a few weeks later they get an email, that is not nearly the same as at the event they get thanked. And then, one of our best practices we try is same day or next day, if we can get a little more formal of an email, but, it doesn't have to be anything more than that, and just thanking them again. And, including certain people, whether it's their leader or peers that are important to them, that can make all the difference.
And on that note, Volunteer Canada has developed a tool with Investors Group on finding out your preference in recognition. So it's called the Volunteer Recognition Tool at volunteer.ca/VRT. And when you as a volunteer take the quiz, it generates the type of recognition you prefer. And so whether it's gifts, whether it's public recognition, whether it's a thank you note, etc. And it's quite lighthearted too. So it's a good tool for individuals and their own awareness of what they prefer, but then that information is invaluable for those in the organizations where they get involved.
Wonderful. I've popped that link in the chat box for anyone who's interested. So that sounds great, Paula. So I think we're going to finish off today with one last question. I'll let everyone join in on this one. ISR, we've discussed, has been around since before formal volunteering even. So presumably people are doing things for the impact and not necessarily to get the recognition. Is it still important to formally recognize, and why?
I would like to answer that first, if I could. I think that it's very important, and I think the question that was posed to Trevor about does Investors Group talk about what they do, and I think it's very important to formally, in the sense of recognize that this is a force in our society that we value and that we want to maintain and feed. So definitely there is a place for it. So that's like to the outside world. And obviously, I think if you don't include it as an organization or a volunteer center or a company, if you don't include it in your formal, whether it's your annual report or your weekly bulletin, or there are different ways that you communicate internally and externally, then you're devaluing it. So I would say there's definitely, and it's an important thing. And it can be formal recognition of informal volunteering as well. I think this is what we're saying about expanding the definition of volunteering, is that it does include, if we are to do this, we are going to have to formally recognize that there are different types and different ways to volunteer.
It's Paula, and if we look at it from the point of view of other industries and waves and disruptions that have happened, it's quite exciting and a challenge for us, but it is important for us to recognize that there are some people who will say, listen, this isn't safe. How do you know who's involved? What are the risks? Are these services reliable by people who are doing things informally, and so on? And I think all of those considerations are important for us to address, and it isn't as though one is going to replace the other. But I think when you again look at the opportunities here, that those who are likely to express their values through individual acts may be as likely at some point to be supportive of an organization who's working on an issue that connects with that issue that they moved forward on. So I think that there are ways to leverage the informal and the individual efforts to organizational sometimes. And I think most importantly for us not to see this as something separate. I think that's for me the most important thing about the inclusivity, that it's all good and it's all connected.
Yeah, and I would just, I would agree as well. I don't think you can exclude it, but I don't know that you want to try and make, identify it as something very separate and unique. It's all part of contributing to community, whether it's, traditional or non-traditional. And there's many different sort of ways to do that. Trends we're seeing, there's micro-volunteering, there's skills-based, these things are all popping up all over the place. And it's all, at the end of the day, contributing to a better community, and it all needs to be recognized. Now, we're certainly not, we haven't figured it all out by any means, and it's going to take some time to figure out how you do measure it and report on it. But to some of the earlier points made, storytelling is extremely effective and impactful, and that is where we've sort of chosen to be in current state. And I think if you can inspire others through that, qualitative reporting can be extremely valuable as well.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you again, Paula, Allison, and Trevor for, giving us your time today. This was a fantastic presentation on such an interesting topic. And on that note, I also just want to say it's been such a pleasure for us partnering with Volunteer Canada on this three-part webinar series this summer. We're really looking forward to our final session in the series as well on August 10th. We're going to be discussing insurance and risk management for nonprofits, so that'll be a great session as well. And just before we sign off, I do want to remind everyone that we will follow up with all of you by email tomorrow morning with the webinar recording and the slide deck. We'll also include a link to a short survey. If you can take a moment to fill that out, it's really helpful for us, helps us refine our content and delivery in the future. And you'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's any topics you'd like to see covered in an upcoming session also. We're also going to include a link there to register for our August webinar with Volunteer Canada in case you're interested on that topic, so do check that out. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.